Bebop was a musical revolution that in historical hindsight may be even more so than it seemed at the time. In a musical sense, bebop or bop was a rejection or an escape from the commercial aspects of swing music. Swing was music for dancers, and therein lay its widespread appeal. In bop, musicians found ways to challenge themselves without the confines of trying to appeal to the tastes of listeners. If you were a bop fan, you had to come to the music, not the other way around. Although there were large bebop bands led by people like Billy Eckstine and Dizzy Gillespie, in general, bop was played by small groups with 2 or 3 horns. Individual solos took precedence over ensemble playing. In a lot of bebop songs, which were often based on the chord progressions of popular songs, the melodies sounded just like the solos. They were more like a launching pad than the core element of the song. Bop vocabulary typically consists of fast chromatic lines that wend their way around the chord tones and scales rather than hewing closely to them. It requires technical virtuosity and, for the musicians who created it, a willingness to conceive and hear new approaches to the harmony. The new sounds were jarring to some ears, and a division formed among both musicians and audiences that was almost political in nature. People who rejected bebop were referred to as moldy figs. John Hammond described bebop as a collection of nauseating cliches repeated ad infinitum. Louis Armstrong said, "All them young cats playing those weird chords, and what's happening? Nobody's working." And Duke Ellington, articulate even when being critical, said, "Bebop is like playing Scrabble with all the vowels missing." There was a racial component to bebop as well. As we've seen, the swing era saw the music that was primarily created by black musicians co-opted and repackaged for white audiences, with white musicians reaping the prime benefits. In Thelonious Monk's words, "We wanted a music they couldn't play." In a less racialized context, bop was an attempt to separate the true musicians from the posers. If you got up on the bandstand with a bunch of beboppers and you weren't able to play at their level, you'd be cut down pretty quick with fast tempos or unfamiliar keys. There was a humorous aspect to the movement. Boppers adopted their own language and fashion, for example, the beret and the soul patch that we see on Dizzy in this picture. But the musicians were dead serious about creating something new, and the effects of their innovations were broader and more long-lasting than they could have imagined at the time. The formative years of bebop in the 1940s are largely undocumented because the Musicians Union called for a strike in 1942, banning all recording. At that time, the American Federation of Musicians was a powerful labor union led by James Petrillo. The goal was to seek compensation for loss of work for live musicians due to records. Under the terms of the strike, radio broadcasts were still allowed and singers were exempt, which led to a boost in their status from supporting act to star of the show. Recording was also allowed for a military label called V-Discs. The strike was successful in that it led to the formation of the Music Performance Trust Fund, or MPTF. Record companies contribute to the fund, which is used to underwrite the cost of live performances, offering free admission. The MPTF is still in place today, administered through the union and paying part of the cost for things like park concerts. As you might imagine, it's not as well funded as it used to be. The bebop era, which we can loosely define as the 1940s, is a dividing line in jazz history. Modern jazz vocabulary, for all its variants, has its roots in bebop much more so than the jazz music that preceded it. Even though it was 80 years ago, bop ushered in what we could call the modern era of jazz. Minton's Playhouse was a club in Harlem that became famous as the epicenter for the development of bebop. The club was opened in 1938 by Henry Minton. Minton had previously owned another place called the Rhythm Club. Importantly, he was also the first black delegate to the American Federation of Musicians, which is the Musicians Union. In 1940, Minton hired bandleader Teddy Hill to manage the club. With the sponsorship of the Schiffman family, who owned the Apollo Theater, Hill instituted a policy of free food and drink for musicians who came to jam on Monday nights, which is the traditional night off for entertainers. At the time, the Musicians Union had a strict policy forbidding musicians from playing for free. Dizzy Gillespie recalled that you could be fined $100 to $500 if you were caught, which seems unimaginably high for the times. On one level, this seems to be an organization working against the members it is supposed to represent and protect. On another, a union's power to negotiate fair working conditions depends on the members adhering to an agreed minimum standard. When musicians undercut each other, it becomes a race to the bottom. Henry Minton's union connections protected the musicians who took part in jam sessions from fines, essentially turning the club into a safe space to hang and play. Minton's became the place to participate in or observe the development of what was called modern jazz, or bebop. The house band at Minton's included Thelonious Monk on piano and Kenny Clarke on drums. Among those who came to sit in during the early years was guitarist Charlie Christian, who was the leading figure in the development of bebop, a title that eventually went to Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie after Christian's untimely death in 1942. There was a competitive nature to the jams, as musicians tried to outdo each other in what were called cutting contests. A natural hierarchy evolved, and musicians ignored it at their peril. Miles Davis, who we see as a teenager in this picture, put it this way: "On Monday nights at Minton's, you'd have 1,000 players up there trying to play. But the musicians in the know didn't even think about playing when Bird and Dizzy came to jam. We would just sit, listen, and learn." Minton stayed in operation until a fire in the 1970s shut it down. It opened in its current iteration in 2013, built on the legacy of being the place where bebop was born.